So, Jorge, over to you.
Thank you, Anne. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today, and welcome to this DevSCA speaker series. My name is Jorge Cuartas. I am an assistant professor of applied psychology at New York University. And today it is my great pleasure to introduce our speaker for today, who is Dr. Francis Bergunst. Francis is an associate professor at the University of Oslo. His research bridges developmental psychopathology, mental health, and climate change with a focus on how climate change is affecting the healthy psychological development of children. His current activities include developing better conceptual models to explain how climate change impacts mental health and empirically testing the effects of specific climate-related hazards, such as heat exposures. The broader aim of Francis and his body of work is to clarify causal pathways and underlying mechanisms to inform the development of effective adaptation and prevention strategies. And I think that that's going to be the specific focus of today's talk. So it's great to see you. Thank you for joining us, Francis. And I'm also really excited in a personal level because Francis is a good friend and a fantastic co-author in a couple of projects that we are conducting. So the floor is yours. Thank you, Francis.
Thanks, Jorge, for that very kind introduction. And thanks for the invitation to talk about this topic, which I'm obviously really excited about and care very much about. Thanks to everyone who's dialing in from different parts of the world at odd hours of the day. I feel like when I was invited to give this talk, I had to think a little bit about what would be most interesting to this group. Often I feel like I just have more questions than answers in this space. So maybe what I'll do is just try to give a little overview of the research landscape, the empirical and conceptual literature at the intersection of climate change and mental health, and then maybe open it up to a bit of discussion at the end to explore some of these ideas together. Go to the next slide. Yeah. So I'll start off by just talking a bit about why we should focus on mental health as a priority globally, and also in relation to climate change, how we can conceptualize different climate change impacts, the empirical evidence. I'll talk a little bit about climate anxiety. When I tell people that I work on climate change and mental health, usually one of the first things they ask is, "Do you work on climate anxiety?" So I want to just address that briefly. And then go into a broader conceptual discussion about some of the measurement challenges in the climate change and mental health space, and then kind of sum up with a view of how I see the landscape and a potential research agenda that's relevant to us as developmental scientists and researchers. I think the first thing to say about mental health problems and why it's a priority globally is that we know from statistics from the World Health Organization that around 1 in 8 people is affected with a diagnosed mental disorder, so around 1 billion people. The costs to the global economy are vast, and the funding currently allocated to mental health care is very inadequate, and especially in relation to what's attributed to physical health care. It's also likely that the estimates of the global mental health burden are much higher than what is commonly assumed. And the reason is a number of recent studies that look at the prevalence of common mental health disorders in the population are pretty striking. So this Lancet Psychiatry paper published, I think, last year showed that across 29 countries, the lifetime prevalence for having a diagnosed mental disorder is around 50%. Around half of the population will have a diagnosed mental disorder at some point in their lives. The paper published in JAMA Psych next to it looked at both psychiatric diagnoses and prescription of psychotropic medications for a mental health problem. And they found that across the life course, around 83% of the population will have either a diagnosed disorder or a prescription for a psychotropic at some point during their lives. So 4 in 5 people. A more recent study based on Finnish data found that this was actually somewhere around 90%. So the chances of having or being affected by a mental health problem, a psychological distress that requires some kind of diagnosis or treatment is extremely high. Which leads us to the sort of statement of abnormal is in fact normal. And so when we're thinking about the many challenges that we face day to day in managing our lives and how those interact with our mental health, you add in another systemic stressor like climate change, and of course you can see how that burden could rise. So why focus on kids? I mean, many of us are developmental scientists, and why should we focus specifically on the early life phase when we considering mental health? And I think for people who work in the mental health space, this is probably quite obvious. Just in terms of just on pure utilitarian grounds, we know that young people make up a very large proportion of the global population. So about 41% are aged 0 to 24. Around 90% of those young people live in low and middle income countries, which we also know are most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. They also have more life years to be exposed to current and worsening climate change. And of course, as I said, climate change will operate as a kind of risk multiplier for existing mental health vulnerabilities. I seem to have missed a slide. Oh, that was the slide I missed. I was wondering where it was. Okay, so this is also just some epidemiological stats for the prevalence of common mental health problems. In children, it's about 1 in 8 at any given time, but we also know that around half of all psychiatric disorders are established by age 18, 2/3 by age 24. So most mental health problems have their onset early in life. So if we want to understand and prevent the onset and development of these problems, we really need to be focusing on the early life phase, going back even to conception or preconception. And of course, we know that that mental health problems, especially more severe ones, affect people across many domains of their life: education, their social relationships, ability to work, and so on, and can have knock-on effects with lifelong consequences. So again, from a kind of prevention point of view, there are many good reasons to be focusing on the early life course. I'm probably preaching to the choir here because we're all interested in developmental frameworks. So, but I just wanted to restate that. Also, based on recent reviews, most people, even in high-income countries, around half of young people with a diagnosed disorder don't actually receive any formal intervention or support. And so there's also a very large untreated mental health burden. Okay, so that's the kind of backdrop of mental health broadly as a global challenge and the specific relevance to young people and the importance of identifying these problems early. And now I want to switch into the question of climate change and how that could operate as a risk factor for these problems. Having some trouble with the slides. There we go. Okay. So I think the first thing, again, anyone who's been working in the climate change space will understand this intuitively. When we're talking about climate change, we're just talking about this umbrella concept that captures a whole range of different climate-related hazards. And what I want to do is try to break these down in a little bit more of a systematic and structured way. One of the challenges or the difficulties I find when I read the research literature is that they're often very scattered. We describe them in quite inconsistent ways. This is something, if anyone wants to work on a project like this about trying to better standardize pathways and terminology in the climate change space, I think it would be a very valuable contribution. So since 2009, the Lancet medical journal has published the Lancet Countdown on Climate Change, which kind of summarizes the effects of all these climate-related hazards on human health. Most of their focus on physical health, they do cover mental health, but mental health has kind of been a latecomer to this discussion. And like in other areas of healthcare, it tends to get less attention. So the idea is here, these both direct and indirect effects of these events can affect mental health. So my thinking on this has kind of been evolving over time and partly through consultation with other researchers and working with people with different perspectives, consulting different kinds of disaster and weather-related hazard frameworks. This is the kind of current model that I'm working with when thinking about climate-related hazards. So we have climate change, and it's leading to hotter average temperatures, which are driving more frequent and extreme heat waves, hurricanes, wildfires, floods, and so on. So these kind of acute hazards. Then we have more chronic and slow-moving hazards, which are things like droughts or disease vectors, changed landscapes and ecosystems, rising sea levels, and so on, which can also affect both health as well as mental health. And then we have another set of hazards, which are kind of complex, interactive or cross-cutting hazards, that things like air pollution, which are partly a consequence of climate change, say through the burning of fossil fuels, but also they're a cause, but also a consequence, for example, increased wildfires. Negative psychological responses, which are neither like acute or chronic, they're kind of somewhere in this middle space. Complex geopolitical changes like wars will probably also fall into that category. So each of these different kinds of hazards can affect mental health in a number of ways. Within each of those hazards, then we also need to do specify a little bit more precisely how those might affect mental health. And what I've been doing, or the way I view that, is that these can be separated into direct, indirect, and vicarious. So if we take an acute event like a heat wave or a flood, you can be directly affected. Maybe you lose your house, someone you know is injured or killed, but you are directly impacted by the event. You can also be indirectly affected. For example, maybe the flood occurs in another part of the town or city or near to where you live. It leads to school closures, disruptions, access to goods and services, but you're not necessarily directly affected. And then the third category would be vicarious exposures, which would be things like seeing or reading about other people's experiences of being exposed to these kinds of traumatic events. So the reason I'm going into this in a little bit of detail is because I think it's important to try to be clear about how we get from this kind of umbrella concept of climate change to the specific hazards, which are both acute, chronic, and complex, and each of those parting through multiple potential different pathways, and sometimes even multiple pathways simultaneously, which kind of so creating conceptual models of these, again, this is a simplification of reality, but minimally at least brings a little bit of clarity about how these different hazard types and pathways can be explained. Okay, so that's the kind of a bit of the kind of conceptual background or framework to the climate side of things. What I want to do now is just talk a little bit about the empirical evidence. Intuitively, there's good evidence that these kinds of extreme weather events like heat waves and floods, drought storms are becoming more frequent, often more long-lasting, more severe. And intuitively, it makes sense that these affect mental health in a number of ways. The question is, how strong is the empirical evidence or the empirical support for that claim? And I think, well, I'll let you evaluate it. There have been a very large number of reviews on systematic reviews and scoping reviews on climate impacts on mental health. Most of them focus on acute impacts, so extreme weather events. There has been one, to my knowledge, that focuses on more slow-moving and chronic impacts. That's that one there. And then more recently, I think published last year, the first umbrella review that I'm aware of was published in World Psychiatry. So impact of air pollution and climate change on mental health outcomes. I'm going to focus on the evidence in the umbrella review, partly because they review the evidence from around 36 or 37 meta-analyses and systematic reviews. And that, in my view, is the most comprehensive overview of the research literature to date. Okay, 32. So in this review, they synthesized evidence from 32 studies, 32 systematic reviews or meta-analyses, including 284 studies. And the main finding was that air pollution is one of the most studied aspects of climate-related hazards on mental health. which isn't necessarily what you would assume. That's partly because air pollution has been a public health concern for many decades, probably centuries, and so it's extremely well studied. And not necessarily all of those studies are related specifically to climate change. The next most common least hazard is temperature. So hot to average temperatures and heat waves. Okay, so let's look at some more specific climate-related hazards. So one of the things that I think is useful about this review is that they actually attempt to classify the quality or the class of the evidence. And what they found that there is for climate-related hazards, highly suggestive, but class 2 evidence for the association between temporal proximity to exposure to cyclones, so tropical storms, and severity of PTSD symptoms. So that's pretty solid. It's a kind of design that you wouldn't be able to use randomized controlled. You'd have to rely on natural experiments or quasi experiments to test. But the evidence there, I think, it appears pretty strong. Short-term exposure to temperatures, mental health, suicide-related behaviors, hospital access for suicidal behaviors and mental disorders. Also, class 2 highly suggestive evidence. A long-term exposure to pollutants is also class 2 highly suggestive evidence. For most of these types of studies, which are almost all epidemiological, the magnitude of the effect is usually in the small range. However, given that potentially millions, sometimes hundreds of millions of people are exposed, the effects across the population, of course, can be quite large. So if you consider a very heat-stressed area like India, when you have a severe heat wave, you can have tens and potentially hundreds of millions of people who are exposed to heat stress. So even small effects across the population could potentially have large effects on the population at different levels with respect to mental health, education, and so on. Okay, so the point I want to make here is that I think the evidence is there, but in many respects it's scattered. It's a little bit erratic. There's not that much evidence evaluating the quality of the studies, for example. And so when we take a more rigorous approach and look at the different types of climate-related hazards and their effects on different mental health outcomes, we kind of left with actually, well, we're confident in a small number of areas, but actually in many other areas, we're not so sure. Which doesn't obviously negates the fact that these kinds of weather-related hazards are almost certainly affecting mental health, but it does mean that we also need to be conscious of the limitations of the evidence, and we also need to generate more robust evidence, review evidence, both primary evidence, but also systematic review evidence to really establish the scale of these kinds of threats. Okay, so that's that. Just want to check the time. Okay. Yeah, so I've summarized a couple of these points. We don't often, most of these reviews just kind of draw a general conclusion. They're kind of narrative synthesis, which can be useful, but it doesn't necessarily quantify effects that basically say like climate change is increasing the frequency and severity of these events, and these events are shown to have associations with adverse mental health outcomes. And so we think there is an association. So it's a lot of inference with not necessarily that much quantification. And so I think we just need to be conscious of that. Most studies also focus on acute hazards, so severe weather events. There's very, very little on the effects of especially indirect effects, but also chronic and slow-moving effects. There are good reasons for that. Of course, it's much easier to study the causal pathways from acute events to adverse mental health outcomes than the much more complex interconnected pathways from chronic or slow-moving changes that affect mental health. Mental health is extremely complex. It's dependent on a whole lot of backgrounds, contextual and systemic factors, and so trying to disentangle those different factors so that you can clearly identify the causal pathways is of course difficult, and so that's just partly the focus on acute hazards is partly just an artifact of the difficulties studying these more long-term hazards. Also, most studies don't disaggregate between children and adults, so they mostly focus on adult populations. So when we ask these questions about how do these kinds of events or climate change broadly affect pediatric or child populations, it's difficult to pull out a single review and say we really have robust evidence to support these claims. Which isn't to say that it's not happening. I think it absolutely is, but we also should be conscious of the strength of the evidence that we have behind our claims that we're making. Okay, so I want to just switch gears a little bit and talk about climate anxiety or climate distress. It's an area that that I do some work in, but it's not a focal area. It gets a lot of media attention, in my opinion, uses up a lot of oxygen in the room when there is discussion about climate impacts on mental health. But I think its actual contribution to the mental health burden is relatively small, or in fact, very small. So when we're talking about climate anxiety, I think my preferred term would just be talking about climate distress. And within that, we would be talking about a bunch of negative psychological responses to climate change. Eco-anxiety, eco-anger, eco-grief, eco-depression. There are many, many other terms that kind of center around this concern, worry, anxiety about climate impacts, but also the broader concerns around ecological changes and converging ecological crises that are very understandably distressing. So if we take the umbrella term, climate distress, we see from international surveys that people are very concerned about climate change, and this is especially true for young people. One of the challenges in this space is that there's also this like intense polarization. You feel like on the one hand, people are very concerned. This is especially true in North America and I'd say the United States, where people are very concerned about this, feel like it's an existential threat. And then they recognize that there's also a substantial portion of the population who actually just think it's a joke. It's a waste of public resources. Why are we even talking about it? And of course, that again, like many kind of social conflicts, further augments or accentuates the kind of distress that people feel around climate change and ecological change and the consequences for their mental health and well-being. So the kind of consensus in the space within the climate distress, eco-anxiety literature is that this is a healthy and adaptive response. If you were at least somewhat concerned about climate change or somewhat worried, you wouldn't adapt or respond or try to adjust either your behavior or to reduce the impacts or to avoid or mitigate them. So the threats, it's there, it's real. We know it's occurring, and so actually, it's probably irrational or arguably pathological to not be concerned about it. Of course, there's a lot of things going on in the world, a lot of bad things as well, and so people just have limited attention to give to these different kinds of crises. But minimally, one would expect a healthy response would be to acknowledge that it's occurring if you have access to that information, which I think is available publicly everywhere, that you would be at least a little bit concerned about these impacts. Yeah, there's also questions about the causal direction. This is something we've done some work on. It's a good question that often arises: is does climate-related worry or eco-anxiety lead to the onset of some kind of mental health problems? And I think the evidence there is really weak. There just isn't really any good evidence as far as I know. Almost all the studies are cross-sectional, and so reverse causation is far more likely. If you're already worried about things, if you're already anxious, you are just more likely to worry about climate change, nuclear war, artificial general intelligence, and so on. And so we in some of our one study that we did, we looked at this longitudinally, and we found that there is a significant correlation cross-sectionally between worry about climate change and higher levels of anxiety, depression, and suicidal thoughts, including at clinically significant levels. But when you look at the longitudinal pattern, the people who are most worried were also more likely to have high anxiety and depression in mid-adolescence. So this is a very difficult question to tease out and establish clear causal pathways for. But as I said, I think I think there is a both theoretical and empirical case that this is a healthy adaptive response and not pathological. And so we're not actually going to see increases in mental health problems associated with worry or concern about climate change. It might be uncomfortable, perhaps some edge cases where people already are highly predisposed for anxiety or depression, but additional, say, knowledge about climate change or its impending impacts could push them into a clinical over a clinical threshold. But for most people, that won't be the case. Okay, so that's the kind of eco-anxiety, climate anxiety section that I just wanted to talk about briefly. Just want to check the time again. Okay. I want to talk a little bit about some of the conceptual work that we've been doing in the mental health space. And that partly relates to how we define mental health, which is just this very broad concept. And Jorge and I have had some interesting discussions. I mean, we come from slightly different professional backgrounds, and at the broadest level, mental health could include all kind of cognitive functions, including things like memory and cognition. But I've tended to sort of go to a slightly narrower conceptual definition as set out by the World Health Organization. So if we just say initially take a definition of what we mean by mental health, so a state of well-being in which the individual realizes his own abilities, can cope with the normal stresses of life, work productively and fruitfully, and is able to make a contribution to his or her community. Very broad, very general definition of what having good mental health means. Arguably not that useful because it's so broad and unspecific. We could then take a definition of a specific mental disorder, so a clinically significant disturbance in an individual's cognition, emotional regulation, or behavior, usually associated with distress or impairment in important areas of functioning. So one of the things that I have been interested in is like, is there a way to kind of bring these conceptual models together or think about mental health in a bit more of a nuanced way that includes both mental disorders and important aspects of mental well-being? And so this is a paper we published last year where we used the concept of the dual continuum model to think about mental health in a more multidimensional way. So what this graphic shows here, on the left-hand side, if we take those two quadrants, you have no mental health problems. So this is, or I should say, this axis horizontal is no mental disorder to severe mental disorder, and then the vertical axis is lowest well-being to highest well-being. So if you're in the top quadrant here, you have high well-being and you also have no mental disorder. That's the optimal state. That's where we all want to be. It's where we want the population to be. You can also have no mental disorder, but have low well-being. So you just your subjective states, maybe you have subclinical symptoms, you're anxious, maybe depressed, but you don't actually have a diagnosed mental disorder. Another category would be C here, where you have a mental disorder, but you actually still have high well-being. So you're subjective, you have a diagnosed disorder, but you're able, possibly because of good support structures, to function relatively well and have good subjective well-being. And then the fourth quadrant down here is that you have both the diagnosed mental disorder and low subjective well-being. And there's actually good empirical, theoretical and empirical support for this model. And what these studies show in evidence from systematic review, that people can fluctuate between these different categories. You can have a mental disorder and have either low or high subjective well-being. Likewise, you can have no mental disorder, but also have both high and low subjective well-being. So the idea here is to think about mental health in a slightly more nuanced and sophisticated way that includes multiple areas of functioning and doesn't just limit to people to diagnostic categories. So just an example of how this could be applied, we applied this recently in a paper we published on suicide, where we looked at how climate-related hazards can increase risk for suicidal behaviors through both having a mental disorder and through lowered subjective well-being. So most people who die by suicide have a known diagnosed psychiatric disorder. It's difficult to get reliable estimates from for these stats, especially low and middle income countries. But somewhere between 10 and 68% of people who die by suicide have no known psychiatric disorder. And so when you're thinking about an outcome like suicide, which is an acute event, we have to take this more sophisticated, multidimensional view of mental health that includes both pathways, psychiatric diagnosis, having a mental disorder, but also a lowered subjective well-being. And again, we've tried to sketch out the relevant pathways using the conceptual framework that I introduced at the beginning, where we're starting from some specific kinds of hazards, vulnerabilities of factors like your socioeconomic status, background factors like gender, that you can be exposed through direct, indirect, and vicarious pathways. Again, a series of potential moderating factors here, like individual or community level responses, government resources and responses, and so on, which then further moderate the extent to which these impacts feed into either mental disorders and lowered well-being. So this is just a kind of another example of how I've been trying to get from this umbrella concept of climate change and the very specific ways it can lead, the pathways, the mediating and moderating process that then can lead it to specific mental health outcomes. Because a lot of it at the moment is just like climate change and then mental health, and they're both treated as these kind of umbrella categories, but actually there's a huge amount of variation even with mental health, even if we just focus on specific disorders. So I'll come to this at the end, but I think we need a lot more focus on specific climate-related hazards like heat or exposure to extreme weather events, the pathways and processes from those events leading to specific mental health outcomes like depressive disorders, anxiety, and so on. Okay, so if we think about a little bit about the research agenda, I think I've actually been saying some of this already. We need clearer definitions of and concepts with respect to both the exposures, so climate-related hazards, and what we mean by mental health outcomes. We also need, in my opinion, more emphasis on the quality of the evidence. It's fine to make claims, and often they're intuitive, and very likely the effects are there, and they probably are causal. But we need to be more rigorous about the quality of that evidence. Something else we can discuss at the end. And then I think, again, and especially relevant to this group, is that if we want to try to understand and especially mitigate these effects on mental health of global populations, we need to be using this kind of life course developmental framework. Because thinking about how these climate-related hazards, where they originate, which areas are most vulnerable, which populations, and how they travel from that initial hazard to the eventual mental health outcome. And so this is a kind of standard model in many respects in like developmental model, developmental psychopathology there, where essentially what you want to do is to try to intervene early, ideally at the point with the mother and the infant, so that you can lower this risk curve here. If you intervene late, like in childhood and adolescence, for example, by providing the mother with information about the risks of heat waves to, say, both pregnancy, but also to early child development. If you're only providing a middle childhood, the child is already potentially exposed to a number of harmful effects of these kinds of stresses on the child. If you leave it even later, of course, the risks increase further. So you just see the steeper rising curve of potential impacts. And so this could be applied to many different kinds of climate-related hazards. So again, I think this should be intuitive to many of the people listening. The point is that if we want to mitigate these effects, we really need to be taking this developmental approach and starting as early in life as possible. That's just a sort of graphic that I created to try to illustrate some of these. This is in a book chapter. I won't go into it because I think this developmental framework is familiar to most people who work in this space. We could come back to it in the questions. Another final point that I just want to emphasize, which I don't think gets enough attention, is the gendered element of climate change. Many common mental health problems are more prevalent in girls and women, especially mood and anxiety disorders. And women are very, in many respects, even in many high-income countries, but certainly in most low-income countries, systematically disadvantaged in so many different kinds of ways. And so it's absolutely critical when we're talking about something like a climate change and its impacts on mental health that we consider this gendered element of climate change. Many women, especially in low and middle income countries, perform work that exposes them directly to climate-related hazards, like collecting water or fuel, which means often traveling long distances, which expose you to weather like extreme heat. Women also often have less representation, less access to resources like land, housing. They're less involved. They have less of a voice in many decision-making processes in most parts of the world, including, say, agenda setting for how to respond and mitigate climate change. And this is something that Jorge and I published a paper on recently in relation to the role of nurturing care and protecting young children. We need to, of course, be involving the mothers. But most nurturing care is actually is still across the world conducted by women, and yet they face many of these systematic additional disadvantages or difficulties, both with respect to exposures, but also to mental health. So anytime I think we're thinking about climate change impacts on mental health, whatever the hazard, we always need to have this kind of consider this gendered element. Obviously, always tested as a moderator in any kind of model. So that's just something I wanted to flag. Do you want any good news? I feel like when I give these kinds of talks, people are like, it's all just so like terrible, and there isn't anything good to come out of this. Maybe you already sort of also have these slides in your own talks if you give these talks. I'll just give you my kind of good news spiel, and then you can maybe give me yours afterwards. I mean, there are sort of rays of light here and there. Cost of green energy is going down a lot, solar and wind, and we have much better early warning systems for severe weather events like heat waves and floods and storms, and that of course saves lives as well as improves mental health. And adaptation to climate change is scaling up. We're nowhere near where we should be, especially given the rates of accelerating climate change. But I think it's important just to say, like, okay, stuff is happening. There are some improvements. One area that I find some solace and hope in is just considering the important gains that have been made in the last 2 centuries. And I think these are just like, we have to recognize and highlight these, that like if you consider global poverty in the last 200 years, I mean, almost everyone lived in pretty extreme poverty 200 years ago in 1820. Fast forward 200 years ago, less than 10% live in extreme poverty. Basic education, huge increase in access to basic education across the world. Literacy, same thing. Democracy, we'll skip that one. Vaccination, same thing. Whoops. just this incredible uptick, and we saved hundreds of millions of lives. Child mortality, same thing. So the point here is that if we look at many indicators of human development, we've just seen incredible great gains that I think we really have to celebrate. That it might feel like the planet's going to hell and everything's lost and it's all for nothing, but it isn't all for nothing, because we just have this technological change that is partly this industrialization, which is partly arguably mainly what has caused climate change, has allowed this to occur. These incredible gains. For humans, fantastic. For other non-animal sentient species, not so fantastic. Another story, but certainly for humans, the gains have just been really extraordinary, and I think that's something we need to acknowledge and celebrate. The last thing I want to say is I think this book is kind of captures the story quite nicely. Hannah Ritchie, who works at Our World in Data, wrote this book, published it I think last year, and one of the points she makes that I think is really useful is saying that we've damaged the planet and the environment in very profound and significant ways. That hasn't been for nothing. And part of it has been this incredible process of industrialization. We have now, arguably, at least in many parts of the world, achieved social sustainability. We're getting to a point where we're having life expectancy across the world of over 70 years. And these are things that are just very impressive and need to be celebrated. The challenge now is to also achieve environmental sustainability, to kind of set the ship on a course that means that we have the social sustainability, these incredible rises in education and living standards and health, and also achieve some kind of environmental, sustainable environmental path into the 21st century. Whether we can achieve that, of course, is an open question, and it probably depends on who you ask and on what particular day. But I think again, this speaks to this message of there's still being hope in what otherwise seems like quite a bleak picture in relation to climate change. That's it. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Francis, for a fantastic talk. I think that your conceptual work, clarifying some of the hazards, the exposures, the mechanisms, and the outcomes, it's really, really helpful and very much needed in the field for us to think more deeply about measurement and about empirical work. So thank you very much for that. Now we have about 15 minutes for questions, so you can feel free to raise your hand or unmute yourself, and yeah, for us to have a discussion. So who would like to start? Yes, Bernanke.
Hi, thanks very much, Francis. Really great talk. And thank you for ending on a note of positivity at the end. I'm going to use those slides. It was really, really good to sort of bear that in mind. So just really commentary for discussion, just to get your thoughts. I see a lot of parallels between what's happening in the climate change world and the evidence base, or lack of, with what's happening with social media and the harms of technology. And how we can get evidence-based policy making to happen when the state of the evidence is not where we would like it to be. So it's just very sobering seeing the slides that you gave about the longitudinal studies, and that there's just the worry that are going to worry more. But we've got all these massive cross-sectional studies, haven't we, like the Lancet Psychiatry one, where the majority of people worry about it. But then the naysayers, the climate deniers, or people who don't believe in any negative impact of social media, will say, well, we don't have the evidence base to put policies into action. And it's just a real challenge, isn't it? Because throughout history, we've also got lots of other examples, like, smoking, for example, where, we were sort of lagging behind with the evidence base before we put things into action. And it's really challenging to see these impacts in front of your eyes, but we haven't got that data. So it's just really to get your reflections on that. And lastly, I was trying to find evidence around the impacts of toxic stress and the impacts of chronic worry about this. And of course, as you said, there's not that much evidence out there at the moment, but just sort of reflecting and thinking about the more that we see the impacts of climate change and the ecological crisis, the more impacts that will have on our children. And eventually our research will catch up, but it's going to be several decades too late. So I just really would like to hear your reflections on that.
I think you summed up a lot of the points. Yeah, no, I agree. It's just very challenging. Uh, I think my sense is that given that we've passed the 1.5 threshold now, and it seems likely that that's going to persist, we're going to probably have multiple years. The Financial Times had an article this morning about the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund, which is almost 2 trillion now, and they're suddenly actually saying like, "Oh shit, this is actually climate change thing looks pretty serious, and we probably haven't factored it in nearly enough." And so I think shifts like this are probably going to mean that there's going to be like the tension is just going to the literal temperature is rising, but also the temperature like for to really understand what these effects are. Like, what are the specific hazards? What are the specific pathways? Who's most vulnerable? How can we protect them? I think all of these questions are just like in the next, in my view, in the next sort of 5 to 10 years are just going to balloon. I think there's going to be a huge amount of attention there. Yeah, but I agree on the evidence question. It's tricky. I mean, as a policymaker, you want to be able to you want to be confident in the quality of the evidence and make sure you cover your own back and that you're also doing it based on the best science. So yeah,
But
and
also there's a
then
moral imperative to act early, isn't there? When you know the
yeah,
science and what's behind,
yes,
and it's that
yes,
constant tension, isn't it?
yeah, yeah.
Jenna?
Yeah, maybe just building off that last question, and also Francis, your much appreciated positive slides. I was wondering if there's a sort of personal win for you as a researcher where you've felt like your work in this space has been seen and used to shift policy, to create a conversation, right? Because I think you are speaking to a lot of researchers right now, maybe who are also thinking, well, what can we do? Or how is this research useful for anyone? If don't we have enough research? Is the research not
Mhm.
just being ignored? So I guess I'm wondering if you have your own sort of positive experience to share as a researcher in this space.
Yeah, good question. Yeah, I mean, I think one of the probably other researchers would echo this. One of the sort of challenges of being a researcher is you just like it's often so distal. The work that you do is it's very hard to evaluate its impact. If it gets cited, that's sort of an indication you feel like okay, at least people are reading it, or if you feel like it said something useful. But it's often hard to quantify in other ways. I think that you maybe get invited for talks like this, that people are interested in the ideas, but it's really difficult, I think, to quantify how much of an impact that's actually having. Um, I'll have to get back to you on that. I'm not exactly sure, but it's a good question. Um, I think publishing that a few years ago with Helen Berry, that first developmental paper, has created a lot of interest in studying and understanding climate change using this kind of developmental lens. And that's been a kind of nice positive feedback that it was a kind of idea that was sort of arrived at the right time. And I think it's been useful. So that's been nice. Yeah. Yeah.
And Samson?
I had another follow-up, which is thank you for that wonderful presentation. What role do you think DevSCA can play? You have a group of DevSCA folks here. It's a
Yeah.
lot, a select group of,
Yes.
bigger group, but I just was curious if you've had any thoughts about what an organization of this kind can
Yeah.
do. That's a broad
Yeah,
question. You can
it
just
is.
say what you like.
Yeah, it's a great question. I actually have been more involved in DevSCA at periods in the past during my postdoc. The challenge, as everyone knows, as a researcher, is you just have no time for anything, and so every additional meeting is just a kind of barrier. And yeah, I mean, we even had discussions about what are some of the ways that what is the purpose of groups like this? Is it to create networking opportunities for people, especially early career researchers, to present their work, share ideas? Uh, yeah, I think it's a good topic for a kind of group discussion, and yeah, I see different avenues. I think one way is to like make sure that our early career researchers, the people who are working in the space, have a platform to share ideas and to kind of build capacity, idea sharing, but also like research capacity, collaborations in this intersection of climate change and developmental science. Yeah. Does that answer your question? Yeah. I mean, it's a tricky question, I think. Yeah.
Okay, we have two more questions. Anne, and after Anne, Alina.
Thanks very much, Francis. That was a really interesting talk. I guess one of, based on my interaction, I guess, with people who are working in the climate space, what you find all the time is this, this sense of despair, of helplessness and hopelessness.
Yeah.
And I was interested, and that also comes from conversations with young people a lot of the
Mm.
time, choosing not to, being sure that they're not going to have children and things like that because they're so worried about the future.
Mm.
And I was wondering whether that gets picked up in the sorts of measures of well-being that are used in the literature, or if that's an aspect that doesn't actually get captured so much. And I think that also links probably with the gender lens as well, that it's also
Mm.
a
Mhm.
more common one among women than men, and girls than boys.
Mm.
Yeah, I've got other questions too, but that's enough for now.
Okay. Yeah. Do these kind of negative psychological responses to climate change get picked up in measures of climate change mental health? Is that
Both the mental health measures, but also the well-being measures.
yeah, yeah. I suppose in well-being measures, yes. It's difficult to say again, there's a sort of bidirectional relationship probably between anxiety, depression, and climate distress or worry about things generally. And so, uh, do they get picked up? Is there sort of, is there some kind of additive effect of climate change? Is that what you mean? Maybe? Uh,
Yeah, it's more a methodological question, really.
yeah,
That the measures that I'm familiar with don't really
yeah,
tap that sense of your future, that optimism about your future and your future life,
right. Yes, yes, okay.
which I think might be one of the places where climate distress is most evident.
Yes, yeah. Yeah, I'm not sure about that. Yeah, I'm not an expert in the climate distress space, and I think I think there's a lot of scope to do work there. I think one of the challenges is, like I said, there are many distressing things happening in the world, and that again, it can be difficult to disentangle uh, one's concern or worry about those different events, and is worrying about climate change today any different from worrying about nuclear war in 1980? And Probably, yeah. So there's a lot of conceptual challenges, I think. But I think, yeah, I think we're just limited by subjective self-reports in the space. But essentially, it kind of comes down to a number of core features of your personality and makeup that mean that you have a certain view of the world, and whether it's climate change or something else. So, sorry, it's probably a very
Yeah,
inadequate
but I
answer.
think I think beyond personality, isn't it also what your exposure to climate disasters has been? How
Mm.
close, how much
Yeah,
you're aware
yeah.
of
Mm.
what the potential is for the future.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Mm.
Alina?
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Francis. I suppose my question really, in a way, overlaps with what Anne Sanson has said, given that you cover such a sort of a broad range, and especially when looking at sort of mechanism apart from exposure to heat or extreme weather events. The question is, what do we then, for example, measure in if we plan a longitudinal data collection, or if we have any type of ongoing adolescent health monitoring, what
Mm.
should we actually, or what could we measure at sort of individual level? Because from what you said, and I totally share your concerns about pathologizing it and sort of framing it as climate change anxiety might be too much. If we
Mm.
focus on worry, because a lot of the studies do focus on worry and concern,
Mm.
as you pointed out, there's this bidirectional sort of association. So I was just wondering if you were, because for example, we are about to collect data from a few countries with the HBSC survey, and we have a measure that taps into sort of worry and different
Mm.
types of worry. But is this enough? Should we, in terms of like the sort of the data that we would be able to collect as individual members of the DevSCA, is there something that we
Yes.
could focus on?
I think it's a very tough, based on discussion with the number of people around this topic. It's just a tough nut to crack. It's because it's all correlated. All these, your mood, your anxiety, and so you add an additional subjectively reported item about climate worry. You could add something about nuclear war, and so they would probably all just correlate. And so even if you had like a cross-lag model where you looked at, I mean, maybe you could have something like the problem is people know about climate change often from very early in life, or at least something about it. So even if you started measuring them simultaneously and then you looked at the cross lag, maybe you could see which one preceded the other. But I think it would ultimately kind of just be confounded by the fact that these things are just all highly correlated. And so maybe I feel like we're just sort of we should be more in this conceptual space of like, or thinking more about like what are the broader personality or social background factors that are associated with, say, worry about climate change, rather than is there a causal relationship between worry about climate change or concern about climate change and mental health, that we just accept that that's kind of co-occurring, bidirectional, probably not causal. Yeah. So at least that's the way I see it. Yeah.
No, thank you. No, this is very helpful. Thank you.
Sure. Yeah.
Okay, I think that we are on time. So thank you very much, Francis, for joining us today. And thank you, everyone, for a great speaker series session today and a great conversation. I really hope that we can continue thinking together about how to operationalize some of the conceptual work that Francis has been moving forward, and for us to continue thinking about measurement mechanisms and causal inference as a group. And with that, I think that we can conclude for today. Thank you very much.
Thanks very
Good
much.
to see
Thanks
you
for,
all.
yeah. Thanks. Bye.